Another way of looking at proofs is the flow proof. So yesterday and the day before, we did 2-column proofs where we organized our information in a table-like image. Today what we're going to do is we're going to organize our data in a flow chart. So we're going to take everything that we need and we need to put it into our final statement saying these two triangles are congruent. So given that you have two given items, we need to somehow organize this. So N is the midpoint of KL. That's what we're going to put in our first box. Okay, every time you have a box, you still have to have the reason, but it's not going to go to the other side. It's just going to go right below it. And the reason is given. Now, N is the midpoint of KL is not the congruency statement. It means that it's going to take KL and cut it into two congruent parts. So where we know now that because we can say N is the midpoint of KL, we can say KN is congruent to LN. And that's because a midpoint cuts KL into two congruent parts. And that is going to bring us to part of these two triangles are congruent. Now something else that's going to tell us that is that MK is congruent to ML, and that's written right here at the bottom, and that's given. So notice how I have 3 boxes here, and those happen to be all for the congruency statement. So we're going to line all of those up. And that, again, is going to tell us that these two triangles are congruent. Now we're missing one thing. And that just happens to be this reflexive side. So MN is congruent to MN because of the reflexive property. And that again brings us to the conclusion. Now we have 3 congruency statements that these triangles are congruent by side, side, side. So yes, it is the exact same thing as we've been doing before in the 2-column proof. It's asked us to prove triangles congruent, so we can stop there. And that's a flow proof. So let's take a look at another one. Here we have an image. It says given AE bisects BD. So the line or segment AE bisects, cuts in half BD. So that means it looks like that. So we would say AE bisects BD. And we know that because it's given. Now, BD is the one that was cut in half. So we would say BC is congruent to DC. And the reason because bisect means divide into two congruent parts or segments. This is going to help tell you why these triangles are congruent. The next one, C is the midpoint of AE. C is the midpoint of AE. And we can say that right here. C is the midpoint of AE. And the reason behind that is it's given. So we can say AC is congruent to EC because midpoint cuts AE into two congruent parts, which again is going to tell us why these two triangles are congruent. So remember, here is your congruency statement. Okay, always line those up. But we are missing one thing. We are missing vertical angles. Let's name those vertical angles. Angle ACB is congruent to angle ECD. And the reason behind that is vertical angles are congruent. Now, you have three congruency statements. You have a side, you have an angle, and you have a side. Look at your sides. Do those form the angle that you said was congruent? If so, we can say that triangle ACB is congruent to triangle ECD, got that from right here, are congruent by side, angle, side. Now, not every time it's going to be laid out for you. Sometimes you're going to have to do it by yourself. So remember, you should always have three congruency statements. So you can draw those three bubbles that you're going to need. And I would put an arrow to one final bubble because that's what's going to be here. I'm trying to prove that KMN is congruent to triangle LMN. And real quick, I apologize. Your givens and your prove are different letters than what I have up here. Make sure you just change them on your worksheet. So how are we going to do that? The first one says MN is an angle bisector of KML. Is that a congruency statement? If not, we need to add one more before it. So MN is an angle bisector of angle KML. Okay, so that means that this angle and this angle are now congruent. And we know this one because it's given. So we can say angle KMN is congruent to angle LMN because bisect means divide into two congruent angles. So you have one congruency statement. The next one is N is the midpoint of KL. Well, that's not a congruency statement, so we need to have one more bubble out here. So N is the midpoint of KL. So that's not a congruency statement, but it was given to us. We can say KN is congruent to LN because midpoint cuts KL into two congruent segments or parts. So now we're out of congruency or out of givens. We need to find one more congruency statement, and it just happens to be right here in your reflexive property. So we can say MN is congruent to MN because of the reflexive property. So do we have enough information to prove these triangles congruent? Here you have an angle, a side, and a side. Now, can you swear in my classroom? No, you can't. So this is not enough given information. Try the last one on your own and then do your homework. Your homework is number 33 through 37.